remember at one point I had a conversation with my mother. She wanted me to go to law school, and she said, well, Shteyngart might be too tough to be a lawyer as a name. So she said, why don't we turn you into Gary Stone? And what she didn't realize was I was getting high almost every day at that point in my life. And the name was ironically beautiful for me. I said, yeah, Gary Stone, attorney at law. It sounds pretty cool. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this, yeah? Good, okay. Can you see me? Oh, yeah, okay. Put that crap down. Thank you. Well, great to be back in Amsterdam, and great to be back at John Adams. I really like this town. Weirdly enough, I was a month ago. I ended up in Beijing on a game show, and one of the questions I don't know how this stuff happens, and one of the questions was, who was the third president of the United States? And I was like, the dude after John Adams, right? And they just looked at me like, failing superpower. Can't remember the third. But then I remember the slave dude, Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, John Adams is great. Great president, great place. So I'll read a little from Kleine Misluk. Great country, tough language for me. The best thing about this book, critics have agreed, really is the cover. And the photos. The photos are amazing inside. Just beautiful photos. The book is, but the photo of me on the front is, this is 1974 in Leningrad, USSR. And they had these photo studios where they would pose a young child with the latest in Soviet technology. So like a fork, And I got this car, and you can see how unhappy I am. If you stroll through the book, there's many pictures of me also crying in front of other Soviet objects, like a telephone. So that's half the fun. Oh, wait. Telephone. Okay, got it. Yeah, good times. So the book is about how I became a writer. And since I live, within 5 miles of Brooklyn, people always ask me, how do I become a writer? I got to become a writer. It's easy. There's two things. First, you have to have asthma, as you mentioned. You got to have asthma. It works for Proust. It works for a lot of people. And being born in Leningrad was great because it's built on a swamp. So there's a lot. Part of the fun of doing this book tour is people don't even give me books to sign anymore. They give me their inhalers to sign, especially around Seattle. But yesterday, or 2 days ago, I was in The Hague, and this woman gave me a Dutch inhaler. It looked so futuristic. It was just beautiful. I'm very proud of your technology for breathing. But as a child, I had terrifying asthma, and it was really wonderful from a writer's point of view, because I was always about to die, and because there was no inhalers in Russia at that time. So the ambulance would come and take me away to the hospital. So every week I would have that, and every week I would sort of regress further into myself, my Proustian self, if you will. So that was good. And then the second thing that's very helpful is to have a grandmother who writes. And my grandmother, Galia, was a journalist for a paper called Good Evening, Leningrad, which was much better than Good Morning, Leningrad, which was the sort of cheerful TMZ-like newspaper. Said that in LA, everyone was like, I write for TMZ. But one day when I was about 5 years old, my grandmother said, hey, asthma boy, you want to be a novelist? And I said, I was already thinking like a writer, I said, how much does it pay? And she said, I'll give you a piece of cheese for every page you write. And I loved this Soviet cheese. It was this yellow-orange, you could take an eye out with it. It was this giant cheese. And she said, a piece of cheese for every page. And so the next thing is I needed a topic to write about. Now, Grandma was, of course, quite a communist, and outside of our window was the biggest statue of Lenin in all of Leningrad. We called him the Latin Lenin, because he looked like he was about to rumba. He had this very cool look. So each morning after an asthma attack, I'd go downstairs and hug the big pedestal of Lenin. That's how much I loved him, the way people love their teddy bears. So my first novel was called Lenin and His Magical Goose. And in it, Lenin meets a talking goose from Armenia or Georgia, somewhere around there. And together they invade Finland and try to create a socialist revolution there. But then Lenin and the goose get into a terrible fight because Lenin we know is Bolshevik. The goose we find out is Menshevik. This is, by the way, this was a huge topic for 5-year-olds in the Soviet Union. One of the first pictures in the book is me in the traditional Soviet boy's outfit of a sailor outfit and tights. So this is 12 years of psychoanalysis, right here, right in front of you. And I'm reading this giant Talmudic-sized book, and the book is the history of the Civil War. So again, this 1917 was the big question of our times in 1979. So in the end, Lenin finds out that the goose is Menshevik, and he eats him for political reasons. But we also find out that Lenin suffers from asthma, just like I did. My grandmother loved it, and she paid me 100 pieces of cheese for the book. Even today, Random House, my American publisher, pays me in cheese, which is great, but hard to sell. So then we emigrated to America, and I had to leave Lenin behind, and I had to learn English and also some Hebrew, because I was sentenced to 8 years of Hebrew school for a crime I did not commit, but there it was. And 1980 was a very difficult time to be a Russian in America. I remember Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech, and there were all those movies, Red Dawn, Red Gerbil, Red Hamster, everything was red. And I had to pretend to the kids in Hebrew school that I was actually born in East Berlin, not in Leningrad. So you know things are bad when you're trying to convince Jewish kids you're actually a German. But yeah, I had the whole accent down, and yeah. And we were really poor. I had one shirt and one pair of pants and a bunch of T-shirts that the parents of the kids in Hebrew school had donated. And my toys were a pen, that was a toy, and a Chewbacca action figure someone had given us that was missing half of his paw. And from Russia, I had a fur coat and a fur hat made out of some woodland animal. And the teachers would actually take me aside and say, you know, you really need to get rid of your furs. Kids will play with you more if you're furless, which is true in adulthood as well, I think. And then, when I was about 11 years old, a momentous thing happened at Hebrew school in the guise of a substitute teacher called Miss S. So I'll read you a little section from that book, and then we can commence with our fun, and then I can take some questions or complaints you may have. So what happened basically was that at this point, I was the second most hated boy at Hebrew school, the red gerbil. And I thought, what if I wrote a science fiction novel and showed it to all the kids in school? Maybe they'd learn to like me. And so copies of these books exist. My parents were kind enough to keep them. Hundreds of pages of little boy scrawl. Let's take a look, why don't we, at the first page. Chapter 1, Something is Wrong. And boy, was it ever, you know. I never knew the Russian word for child services. But then Miss S came along. On one of our first days on the job, Miss S asked us all to bring in our favorite item in the world and to explain why these items make us who we are. I bring in my latest toy, a dysfunctional Apollo rocket ship whose capsule pops off with the press of a lever, and explain that I have even written my own novel. This passes largely unremarked as the latest batch of Star Wars X-Wing fighters and My Little Ponies are paraded around. Finally, Miss S holds up a sneaker and explains that her favorite activity in the world is jogging. P.U., a boy cries out, pointing at the sneaker and holding his nose, and everyone except me laughs their wicked child laugh. I am shocked. Here is a young, kind, pretty teacher, and the children are intimating that her feet smell. Only me and my 200-pound Leningrad fur coat are allowed to smell around here. I look to Miss S, so worried that she'll cry, but instead she laughs and then goes on about how running makes her feel good. After we have all finished explaining who we are, Miss S calls me over to her desk. You really wrote a novel, she asks. Yes, I say. Yeah, it's called The Challenge. May I read it? Yes, you may read it. I will brink it. And brink it I do, with the worried admonition, please don't lose Miss S, okay? And then it happens. At the end of the English period, when a book about a mouse who has learned how to fly in an airplane has been thoroughly dissected, Miss S announces, and now Gary will read from his novel. His what? Oh, but it doesn't matter because I'm standing there holding my composition notebook straight from the Square Deal Notebook people of Dayton, Ohio, zip code 45463. And looking out at me are the boys beneath their little flying saucer yarmulkes and the girls with their sweet aromatic bangs, their blouses studded with stars. And there's Miss S, who I'm already terribly in love with, but who I've recently learned has a fiancé, not sure what that means, can't be good. but whose bright American face is not just encouraging me, but priding me on. Am I scared? No, I'm eager, eager to begin my new life. Introduction, I say. The mysterious race. Before the age of dinosaurs, there was human life on Earth. They look like man of today, but they're a lot more intelligent than man of today. Slowly, Miss S says. Read slowly, Gary. Let us enjoy the words. I breathe that in. Miss S wants to enjoy my words. So I continue slowly. They built all kinds of spaceships and other wonders, but at that time the Earth circled the moon because the moon was bigger than Earth. One day, gigantic comet came and blew up moon to size it is today. As I'm reading it, despite the many errors, I'm hearing a different language coming out of my mouth. I do full justice to the many misspellings, the Earth circled the moon, and the Russian accent is still very thick, but I am speaking in what is more or less comprehensible English. And as I'm speaking, along with my strange new English voice, I'm also hearing something entirely foreign to the squealing and shouting that constitutes the background noise of my Hebrew school. Silence. The children are silent. They're listening to my every word, and they will listen to the story for the next 5 weeks as well, because Miss S will designate the end of every English period as Gary novel time. And they will shout out throughout the English period, when will Gary read already? The school is close to Long Island, so just give you an idea. And I will sit there in my chair, oblivious to all but Miss S.'s smile, excused from following the discussion of the mouse who learned how to fly in an airplane, so that I may go over the words I will soon read to my adoring audience. And God bless these kids for giving me a chance. May their God bless them, everyone. Thank you.
The teacher also, just before the passage you started to read, she talks about how she shows her sneakers. She likes running.
Yeah.
And then she shows her sneakers, and they are smelly.
Yes.
Or can you know, they're smelly, and the children laugh at her for that.
Yes.
And you are shocked.
I'm shocked, yeah. How could you laugh at a pretty teacher like that? In Russia, you could never yell at laugh at a teacher at all. I mean, there are consequences for that. My next book is a children's book called Putin and His Magical Goose, where he finds out the goose is gay and doesn't eat him, but, you know.
But were you was the fact that she was that she didn't mind being laughed at?
Yeah, that was amazing to see that because, kids would laugh at me all the time with the giant fur hat and poor and all that. And they didn't really know, again, being a commie in that time. And my father said, these kids are going to love you because you're Jewish just like them. It doesn't really work like that. But she was amazing in that people laughed and she just smiled and went on with her telling about her story. And that really made an impression on me. And I thought, whatever it takes, I've got to become more like that. I've got to become more sure of myself. And I think one of the reasons I started writing these books is because when you're reading, you don't have an accent on the page. You only have an accent when you speak. And I would, of course, practice very hard to lose my accent. The singer back then was called Neil Diamond. Has anyone? Oh, God, right? Yeah. Do you remember? You were, yeah.
Yes,
Your circumcision was coincided with, yeah.
With your birth, yeah.
So I would practice in there. I would say, they coming to America, every time unfurling flag, today. And that's how I started to lose the accent, but it took until 14 to get there. And before that, I had these books to sort of make friends with.
You make it seem so easy to write a memoir and to make it funny and everything. But at the same time, it must be a terrifying thing to start, especially with the complicated history you had. Yeah. What made you decide to write a memoir?
Yeah, well, it'd be nice if I had an imagination and can write about other people, but...
Well, you did. You wrote 3 novels.
But those 3 novels, the main heroes were very sort of the Soviet Jewish Nebish was big in those books. In Super Sad, there was one of the main characters was Korean American and younger and a woman. So that was very exciting for me to do, to try to get out of my little Russian cage and try to do that. But I thought, if I wrote a memoir, I would never have to write about that again. And this book, I mean, it's like a fire sale. Everything about me must go. Once you finish reading this, it's like TMI, as they say, too much information. Everything is in there. So, although huge parts of this book were outsourced to India. I don't know if you caught that, but there's a scene where my mother's wearing a sari for no good reason whatsoever, and that was my Pratik in Bangalore doing that part. But yeah, this is my last big sort of Russian book, and the next book is going to have an attractive woman at its center. So.
But what made you decide to do it?
Well, I was 39, which in Russian years is 68. I thought, how much time do I have left? Because every man in my family, 58, the heart attack and the stroke and all that. So that was one reason. And as I said, also getting rid of all this material so that I could do something else. But I felt also that I was at the point in my life at 39 where despite all the drug use in college, I still remembered some things that had happened pretty well. But I wasn't old enough to be sort of taken away by the sort of sentimentalization that I sometimes see in memoirs where, it was so, those were the best of times. It wasn't at all. It really sucked. So I wanted to be kind of in that middle where I could remember things well, but without falling into a kind of florid prose about what had happened.
But then still, I mean, if you weren't afraid that it wouldn't be possible to tell this. What I mean to say is that you had 3 novels in which you used your own life, so you might as well go on, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it very, very dangerous to give it up all now? Something must have held you back, or?
Well, when the Russian Debutante's hand job came out in 2002. That was the first book from my generation of Russian Jewish immigrants. And since then, there have been many, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen really great writers, David Bezmozgis, Lara Vapnyar, the list just goes on and on. But I was very scared to do that because it felt like a kind of airing of dirty laundry. Nobody else understood what our community was about in America. And it was a little scary, but I was shocked that there were books by these great writers, Juno Diaz from the Dominican Republic, Jhumpa Lahiri from India, Cheng-Rae Lee, who was my mentor, who's a Korean-American writer. But there was nothing from Russian-Americans, and that was shocking given the quality of, I still think Russian fiction is the best fiction of the 19th century. So I really wanted to fix that pretty quickly, but I was very scared. What would my parents think? Luckily, they don't read English well. And my first 3 books have been translated into Russian with great reviews in Russia, like Balding Traitor Betrays Motherland. That was for Absurdistan. That was pretty good. But this book, thankfully, has not been translated, and the rights haven't been sold. So let's
the rights haven't been sold?
They don't want it. They're like a memoir. Screw that. So let's just...
the book's about the history of a writer. That's often also the history of a reader. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit of your history as a reader, what you started out reading?
Yeah. The original book that I loved was the Swedish book, Niels and the Wild Geese.
Niels Holgersson.
Yeah, that dude. Yeah. And it was funny. I was just looking at that book, and like in America, that would be taught at, I don't know, university, but in Russia, this was like preschool. Education was really good. And because it's a very complicated book, but it has a very interesting motif that fits in with the Soviet motif, which is about a kid who's bad, who's shrunk down to size. That pretty much describes, being a citizen in the Soviet Union, or in today's Russia, for that matter. So, but I was obsessed with that book, and I think Lenin and his Magical Goose, in some ways, was a ripoff of that. And then I started to read. We had Tom Sawyer and the boy we called Geckleberry Finn, and I loved Geckleberry. And I loved Betty Thatcher, Tom Sawyer's girlfriend. That was my first crush, I think.
This you read in Russia?
Which I read in Russian with an introduction by one of Stalin's henchmen. The book was from the 50s, and it was, talking about how this book typically shows how racist America is, which wasn't untrue, the story of Jim the Slave and all this stuff. But it was, that was sort of my preparation for coming to America, was Geckleberry and Tom and Betty and I didn't see the Mississippi until a few years ago, but when I saw it, I was like, this is where it all happened, all that misery, yeah. So that, and then after that, Yeah, so the beautiful thing was we didn't have a television in the house. My parents were against TV, and also we were poor, so we didn't have a TV. So outside of our house, everything was about, in the 1980s, was about these stupid shows, Knight Rider, the A-Team. Do you remember this stuff? But we had, inside our house, it was Chekhov's Lady with Lapdog all the time, so it was a huge difference. At one point, my father was called to a parents-teachers conference in Hebrew school, and the teacher said, "We hear Gary reads Dostoevsky in the original." And he said, "No, only Chekhov." So, but that's what I grew up with. Chekhov was sort of the dessert after a big meal. And that was made quite an impression on me. And then finally we did get a television set, and then I stopped reading, of course, for many years. And then I ended up at this very sort of cool Marxist college in Ohio called Oberlin College. Yeah, you've heard of it. I majored in Beatles studies or whatever. It was a tough school. But that's where professors really started to encourage me to write more. And it's funny, at Oberlin, being a heterosexual white male was the worst thing you could be. And so after all those years of pretending I was East German and trying not to be Russian, I was as Russian as I was making borscht and wearing the whole Cossack thing with the bullets. And, it was, but that's when I started writing about Russia. And that's when I started going back in my own mind to all this stuff that I'd suppressed for so long. And so that's when I started writing my first book, my first novel, which, again, as you've mentioned, was heavily autobiographical as well. So that was the floodgates sort of opened at Oberlin. And by the time I graduated, the idea was I was going to be a lawyer, because my parents said, you're too dumb to be a doctor, you can be a lawyer. And by that point, the professor said, you're not going to be a lawyer.
And when you went to Oberlin, was this the sort of writer you had envisioned yourself to become? Like, did you imagine you were going to be writing about that history, or what did you want to be a different writer?
Well, I wanted to write about politics, and I was kidding about a Beatles major. I was a politics major. I wanted to write about politics in a big way, and I wanted to get a PhD in politics at one point. But in some ways, the stories that I was writing really were a rehashing of the politics of the 20th century, because that's sort of my story. I was born in one failing superpower and ended up in, So that's the grand story of the 20th century in a way. And so I realized that so much of the work that I was going to be doing in political science anyway was work that I was doing in my stories and the beginning of the novel I was starting, which was.
But were you always writing those stories? Like after writing these stories, were you always writing little novels, or did it really stop because of television?
It stopped. It stopped because of television, and I went to this high school in Manhattan, which is this sort of holding pen for international math and science nerds. It's called Stuyvesant. Oh, after Peter Stuyvesant, the first governor of New Amsterdam. And this school was hard. All our parents beat us. It was all immigrant parents, but mine didn't beat me enough because I was not a good math and science student. All the other kids went straight to MIT or whatever. But I was not good, and that's why I went to Oberlin. The only Ivy League, my parents were, of course, crushed that I couldn't get into a better school, but the only Ivy League school I could get into was the Cornell School of Hotel Administration. And I almost went there just to please them, and so I could be running
and a little bit
the
about
Krasnopolsky or something.
And why didn't your parents want a television in the house?
Well, for cultural reasons, they knew that was the end of the reading life, and because they couldn't afford one. But the one we finally found was in a garbage can and was this big. And I was only allowed an hour a week, which was not a lot of TV. But my grandmother, who was a lovely woman, of unconditional love kind of grandma, she had a TV from the 1940s, a Zenith, possibly the first TV ever made. And it got either picture or sound, but never at once. So what I did, and this actually helped in the writing, is I would sit down and I would listen to the sound and I'd write down everything I heard. And then when it was rebroadcast, I would try to match the picture to the sound, which was a pretty cool exercise when you think about it. But that's how I learned about American culture, was because of that. And it was absolutely fascinating, that part, because it felt like, now I started to understand the kids in school. For example, Gilligan's Island. Do you remember this show? What a shock that was to see Gilligan. And I kept thinking, how can a country as rich...
I think in Holland... Did it air in Holland, Gilligan Island? No, so
you didn't have Gilligan's
Island?
Island?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, so it's these castaways are stranded on an island, and each one is an archetype. So there's the beauty queen, the professor, and then there was the millionaire and his wife. So that was my big shock was, how can a country this rich like America not rescue a millionaire and his wife? You know, they would send their best warships after them or something. Buck Rogers, Three's Company, that was interesting. Do you have that? No. Oh, God, no wonder you're such a cultured country. You avoided all of this. Good for you. Well done. But to me, this was very important. And again, when I started sort of getting to know these kids, I began to write pop culture satires, but also satires of religion. So this was a very tough Hebrew school. This was the kind of Hebrew school where a rabbi once said to me, "It's because of you the Holocaust happened." All I was doing was eating a piece of ham in the bathroom. And I remember thinking, did I do it? You know? And so I started writing a satire of the Torah called the Gemara, in which Exodus became Sexodus, you know. And it was written on an actual scroll, you know. And instead of Sarah being the matriarch of the Jewish people, it was Brooke Shieldsowitz. I made Brooke Shields Jewish, which was a huge mitzvah when you think about it, a good deed. So that was my, and kids loved it. The Gemara was passed around along with photos of Brooke Shieldsowitz in People magazine. And what happened was very interesting. So there were only 2 or 3 Russian kids, and we were all the Russians. That's all people knew about. Oh, the commies coming, the Russian. But I began to move away from my identity with that, but with those things, and I started being known as the crazy kid. You know, the one who writes this crazy crap. And in our yearbooks, in the end of the 8 years of Hebrew, when we were the handcuffs were unlocked, each kid was given in the yearbook title of a song to go with them. And all the Russian kids got, you know, Back in the USSR or something like that. And mine was, They're Coming to Take You Away, haha. And I thought that was a huge, you know, improvement. I was no longer the commie, I was just that weirdo. And that's what it's been like ever since.
But which books influenced you when you were satirizing, or was it just something you came up with yourself, or were you reading Mad Magazine and things like that?
You got it, it's amazing you guessed it, but yes, Mad Magazine was one of the things we were reading. Yes,
and that you were allowed to read at home also.
Kids would have it, and I would, we would read it together. At this point, because of the Gemara and stuff, I'd made a best friend, my first American friend. His name was Jonathan, and there's a whole chapter devoted to him in this book. That was unbelievable. You know, I was an only child. Russians don't breed in captivity, and so, you know, this was my best friend. And I was so excited to have a best friend. That we just spent all our time together, and we gave up on school. It was the education was so low that we just started writing a sort of novel together, one of those kind of build your own adventure novels where, you know, you would complete the next sentence of it, and then we would do that. We would sit next to each other and just do that back and forth, which was great. So yeah, that's when I thought, is there anything that writing can't do? You know, it makes you friends. It makes your accent go away. It's changed my life.
You're still not very much a fan of television and internet and everything if you compare it to literature, right? Like novels are very important to you.
I would say that we are living in the golden age of television. A lot of this stuff is really, really, really good. And what television did is it basically took the novel and put it on screen. The Sopranos, The Wire, True Detective, which is part of a book. I mean, these are shows that really use the entire novelistic approach to an incredible way. I mean, because they chop up. It's like reading a 3,000-page novel because you have such a huge canvas. You have
not now. I mean, but
like Gilligan's Island. No, it didn't compete with that. No.
Yeah.
Chekhov is still better than Gilligan's Island. Yes.
This is a little bit of a, I don't know how to explain. It's maybe a strange question, but I was just wondering, like, there is this theory that the novel, if you read enough novels, Russian masters, you become an enlightened, liberal person. Whereas in your household, that's what you were reading. At the same time, you were very much Reagan-loving Republicans.
Yes, Russians are the strange group of people that make republicanism and Tolstoy come together. Who else would have done this? But I think most citizens...
But is it a misunderstanding to think that novels make a better person out of you?
Well, obviously, in this case, it's true. Yes, this would be the proof in the pudding, because I was not a very enlightened person. The first magazine subscription I had was for the National Review, which is... William F. Buckley Jr. was the editor, and Margaret Thatcher was on the cover, on every cover. And it wasn't until high school that when I went to, because it was also the first time, high school was the first time I left this very monochromatic environment and went to Manhattan. We were so isolated that I thought that the 3 skyscrapers on Queens Boulevard in Queens, that was the Manhattan skyline. It was a huge shock that there was actually stuff behind it. And that's when, in this school, 60% of the students weren't European or white. It was mostly Korea, China, India, the math countries, so to speak, and Russia, another math country. So that's what it was. It was just us nerds together, and you couldn't. I mean, how could you keep up your republicanism in an atmosphere like that? It was very hard. So,
but the literature didn't change you, or so what did it bring you?
No, I don't. I think it's a mistake to think that that literature is by itself an enlightening function. I mean, one can read anything and miss the point. The stories of Chekhov are all about empathy, but I was not a very empathic child growing up. All I wanted was, I was poor, so I wanted to be rich, and I didn't care who I'd step over to get there. This is before Oberlin, and I decided to just starve myself as a writer. But yeah, that was the idea. I don't see an exact correlation. But, studies do show that people who read more, engage in democratic, vote more and stuff like that.
I don't even know if democratic people are that much better human beings. But I was just interested to know how you thought about this. And then there's one thing that I read, and I thought maybe you can read it. It's about how you discovered or how comedy came into your life. That just happens to be a thing that I'm interested in.
Okay. Yeah, I heard about that. I heard you do that
first questions.
Yeah.
So the first, this paragraph.
Down to where? To the top.
Just when you start mentioning comedy.
Okay. I can't speak English too good, so I'm demoted by a grade. Instead of starting in second, I'm sent to the first. In every grade through senior year of college, I will be surrounded by boys and girls 1 year younger than I am. The smarter kids will be 2 years younger. In the annual class photo, I will find myself handed down from the top row with the tallest kids to the bottom row because even as I grow older, I somehow grow relatively smaller.
I think I gave you the wrong. This is exactly my children with the flu.
It's a lovely passage, but I guess once again you want to point out that I'm short in Holland.
No,
thanks.
This is horrible.
Great.
This is horrible.
I'll continue to shrink.
This is where I normally wake up. No. At a certain point, this is.
Is it in the same passage? Wait.
Yeah, it's about at a certain point you say from here things go downhill.
Oh, right. Okay,
and you.
Okay.
You know where it is?
But here at age 7 begins my decline. Oh, I'm talking about how smart I am at age 7.
No, but it's.
No, it's true. It's true. I was pretty smart. Yeah. But here at age 7 begins my decline, first through the wonders of Hebrew school, then through the tube of American television and popular culture, then down the 3-foot bong of Oberlin College. The sharpness of my little boy's intelligence will diminish step by step, school by school. And survival will mean replacing the love of the beautiful with the love of what is funny, humor being the last resort of the besieged Jew, especially when he is placed among his own kind. That's pretty good, yeah.
Yes. But can you elaborate on it a little bit?
Well, it's funny, when you're surrounded by Jews, well, I'm not going to say the Jews are intrinsically funny, but,
No, not the fact that you're around Jews that makes you funny. It's the fact that you lose your sensibility. It's either, like, humor is for the survivor.
Right. I think so, and I think that's one reason why well, going back to Jews, I mean, Soviet humor was essentially Jewish humor for the longest time. And the idea, Jews would tell Jewish jokes because the idea was let's make fun of ourselves before anyone else can, And that's what I grew up with. I grew up with these endless retelling of these jokes. And these jokes had a very anti-Semitic flavor. I mean, my father would take me aside, would take me on walks through the parks of Queens, and he would tell me the soap opera that he created, the science fiction soap opera called The Planet of the Yids, in which the Yids had an intergalactic planet that was constantly being attacked by space Slavs with lard torpedoes. And then there was a Captain Sharansky, after Nathan Sharansky, obviously, who built this circumcised space shield around the planet. And that would deflect the lard torpedoes. the unkosher lard torpedoes. So that's what I grew up with as a kind of humor, as a base for humor. And the idea, I think, was that my father grew up in a very anti-Semitic country, and that form of humor was his brand of survival. And then when I was placed in Hebrew school, that was my brand of survival as well.
But it's almost as if you don't trust your own sense of humor. Like as if you feel that you're more in survival mode than in...
Right. Well, because when I was making these jokes at first and writing these books, there was an element of pleasure, but it was always superseded by you have to do this to not be the red gerbil anymore, you know. And it took me a while, I think, until I made friends with my best friend at the time, Jonathan, and we began doing this, you know, and I began to shed my accent, that I started to really take my time and enjoy the humor of it and the absurdity of it, you know. That took quite a while to get there. And even now, you know, when I write a book like this, there's a lot of discomfort in doing this for many reasons. But then the key is, how often do you turn back to the humor? You know, when do you interject the terrible metaphor that I created is that the humor is sort of the intercontinental ballistic missile, right? And the payload, the nuclear payload, is the tragedy, you know. So, but that's very small, and you often just see the missile. But what you want to explode is oh God, this is a terrible analogy. It's getting more and more tortured, but you see what I mean. Yeah.
One of the things in your book is you talk about your psychoanalysis, and you confess that you made fun of psychoanalysis in Absurdistan, but that it meant more to you than you would maybe.
Yeah.
Was it hard for you not to make your psychoanalyst laugh? I mean, you are so good at making people laugh.
It's hard, and I you know, and there was a big article in the New York Times by Daphne Merkin, who was talking about how she makes her psychiatrist laugh and how hard it is not to make him laugh. But I think, again, because most, you know, I think that's a very common thing in New York. And by the way, I'm not one of those crazy 5 times a week. I'm only there 4 times a week. So, and it's only been 12 years, so it's just going to stop soon. But it's at this point, no. And also remember that it's psychoanalysis in the old Freudian model is the psychiatrist doesn't say anything, so you're not getting a reaction. You know, he didn't say anything until about 7 years. I told him I was getting engaged. He has this hobby. He loves diamonds. Psychiatrists do really well in New York. So his hobby is collecting diamonds, and big diamonds. And I said, oh, I'm getting engaged. Should I go to Tiffany's, this expensive store should I go to, breakfast at Tiffany's? Should I go to Tiffany's to buy a diamond? And he said, for the first time, he said something. He said, what are you, crazy? He said, I got a girl for you. She'll give you a good price. Yeah. And I was like, I got him to speak. He didn't say congratulations. He said, diamonds, eh?
But do you keep diaries or anything like that?
Yeah, I do. And I think the as much as I hate the whole technology thing, the iPhone has been great for that, because I just type it in wherever I go. I'm always traveling, and the iPhone's great because you can be talking to some crazy person who's saying some horrible shit, and you can just be typing it all down, and that person doesn't know. So on the ride, I went to The Hague first, and I was being driven by a guy. Yes, this was 2 days ago, from Schiphol to The Hague. And the guy turns to me and he says, first thing he says is, isn't it terrible what they're doing to Black Pete? And I was like, And he said, it's horrible. He came down a chimney, don't you see? He's not a Moor at all. And I was like, okay. I'm like, how long is this ride going to be? And he said, there's no racism in this country. We hate Muslims. That's the only ones. And at this point, I had my phone out. I'm like, yeah, keep talking. All right. So that, and then I file away. If I need Dutch cab driver, I'll just hit that. And I could write that very quickly.
Holland is still very much coming to terms with this whole idea of immigrants and immigration. And a lot of people are very scared that Holland will change forever, or that what's your take on that, or do you know?
I love immigrants. Oh my God.
No,
my favorite people. No, seriously, and countries need immigrants desperately, and countries that don't have good immigration policies will become Japan, over the long run. And as much, I have a lot of problems with the way income is distributed in America and the way that, a lot of the directions the country's going in. But immigration is the big saving grace of the country. The fact that America can assimilate pretty well compared to, say Italy or Germany or other countries. And the fact that, I look, for example, at my little literary fiction, that little branch of it that I write in, and almost half of the writers that are known today are from immigrant backgrounds, and that's just so rare. So I think that's one thing that we do right, and I was hoping that Obama could get this law passed, the new Immigration Act, which would have been amazing, but we have a dysfunctional government.
I was more wondering, like, what you see in Holland now is that there's always a certain moment in which young immigrants, after arriving and wanting to adapt, sort of go back to their own roots and sort of reject the country where they are in.
Yeah. No, I saw there was some kind of series or some kind of photo exhibit where it was people of Moroccan and other heritage holding up their passports, and I think it said "I am Dutch" underneath or something like that. Right? That happened. I wasn't unasked it. That happened. Okay.
But do you think a government can do something to make it easier for immigrants or for those two to meet, non-immigrants and immigrants?
It's a tough call. I don't know. Because I honestly, and I don't know enough about Holland to make a prescription for how you guys should assimilate immigrants. But I will say that, because this is our founding myth, is that we're a country of immigrants. Of course, there are many Native Americans who were there who didn't emigrate from anywhere. But the founding myth is we all sailed in from somewhere. And that, I think it makes it really, if I wasn't a Russian, if I was something else, it would have been a lot easier to assimilate, because that was like, coming from 1980 during the Cold War, when people thought that the Russians were going to annihilate them. That wasn't cool. But in general, I think the assimilation process, and I see it with my younger relatives coming in from Russia, it's a very easy process, especially now when the world is so globalized. When we came from the former Soviet Union, we had, our only thing we knew about the West was somebody had given us an ABBA cover band record, and my mother loved that song. Money, money, money. That was capitalism 101 for us. Always sunny in the rich man's world. But kids now, they have all the technology. A kid from Bombay or Shanghai or Dubai will have the same accoutrements that a kid in New York or in LA will have, and will probably watch the same shows on that thing. And so I think there's a lot of, the globalization has made it much easier to cross between borders, which was certainly not the case when I came from Russia, and probably wasn't the case for people from a lot of countries too. But America, like a great sponge, does suck up the best of the world, and that's keeping a lot of our economy going, even as the manufacturing has left for China and stuff like that. It's people like Sergey Brin and others that keep it going.